Edtech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and is part of the Foundation's Young Africa Works programming.
Hello and welcome to Edtech Monday Africa. My name is Joy Doreen Vera. If you're joining us for the very first time, Edtech Mondays by MasterCard Foundation is a platform to facilitate critical conversations on the use of technology for teaching and learning by bringing together stakeholders that include policymakers, development partners, edtech entrepreneurs, teachers, as well as parents. Last month on Edtech Monday Africa, our conversation focused on mainstreaming of hybrid models of learning. Our panelists suggested a bottom-up approach, the bottom being implementing hybrid models of learning at the foundational learning level. This month, we seek to establish the role of EdTech in improvement of foundational literacy and numeracy. By age 10, a child in school should be able to read and do basic math, the foundational skills necessary for further learning and the development of advanced skills that are critical to economic development and the well-being of individuals and communities, which is why we'd like to have a conversation on EdTech for the improvement of foundational literacy and numeracy. Without these basic skills, many African children are unprepared for the learning that comes next and are thus not guaranteed the ability to meaningfully learn in secondary school or beyond. We're asking, what are some of the EdTech solutions that can be used to accelerate access to affordable and quality foundational learning in Africa? Share your feedback with us on EdTech Monday at mastercardfdn.org. And let me introduce our panelists to you. John Mwachi, Regional Director, Eastern Southern Africa at World Reader. Rudra Narayan Sahu leads the Early Childhood Education, Foundational and Digital Learning at UNICEF's Eastern and Southern Africa Region Office. We also have Manos Antoninis, who is the Director, Global Education Monitoring GEM Report at UNESCO. Ladies and gentlemen, it's so good to have you on EdTech Monday Africa. Let's begin with the fact that the disparity between enrollment and foundational literacy and numeracy is quite high. What do you think our education ecosystems are lacking at the foundational learning level? And I think it's only fair that I start with Joanne, who is with me here in studio. Yes, Joanne, talk to us.
I think one of the things that's lacking really is resources. Just basic resources to go into these classrooms at ECD level, resources around capacity building of teachers and caregivers at that level so that they can actually do a good job. I know that there's a lot of commitment when it comes to delivery, but there are challenges around how to deliver. You can imagine a teacher in a classroom with 50, 60, 40 young learners who are 3, 4, 5, perhaps doesn't have any teacher assistant to help them out. Their focus is on so many different things at the same time that it really creates challenges. That environment is really challenging for the teacher to be able to deliver with fidelity. So they need resources so that they can get the support that is required to be able to do a good job. And of course, we are talking about EdTech today. These teachers need capacity to be able to access, to be able to integrate the use of that technology within the classroom. There isn't much of that in Africa in the early learning space.
Right. Resources that Joanne puts out as one of the bigger issues that we're lacking in our educational ecosystems. Rudra, I would like to come to you. Of course, you've done work across many African countries, and with the current work that you're doing, where exactly do you think the missing link is?
Thank you so very much, Joy. This is a fantastic question. Particularly, we need to understand why are we in this situation. Right, I'm just going to tell you 4 different things why we are having a learning crisis of this magnitude. Number 1, post 2000, what happened, the temporary solution became the permanent approach within the education system. But what this means is after 2000, when the universalization of primary education came in, mostly the countries or education systems went for temporary solution like teacher recruitment, temporary learning spaces and all that. And even now in 2023, that the system are advocating or practicing the same approaches like your teacher volunteers and also the temporary learning space kind of thing. That means that infrastructure is not adequate. This is one. The second one is, let's say, the inappropriate and poor early child, poor preschool education. But particularly if you see that the resources, as Madam rightly mentioned, the resources are inadequate, inappropriate, the teachers are not prepared well. So particularly the very poor and inadequate preschools education, this is one of the reasons why we have the learning crisis of this magnitude. And number three, that there is a recent study just conducted by Innocenti in UNICEF on the time and task teacher availability, which shows that nearly 15 to 45% of teacher absenteeism prevails in this region. Additionally, there is a gap of nearly 4.1 million teachers in this region. That means we don't have adequate resources for teacher resources to support the classroom transactions. This is number three. And number four, why we are in this situation with the public financing for education, particularly in this region. If you see, most of the countries are spending less than 3% of their GDP on education. Out of 21 countries we have in this region, 12 out of 21 countries are spending less than 3% of their GDP. Even some countries like Somalia spend only 0.3% of their total GDP on education. So that means that these are the key four reasons on my sense why we are in this situation of learning crisis of this magnitude. Over to you. Thank you.
Wow. And, just listening to you saying that some of the reasons that you've been able to find out is that there's teacher absenteeism and then also low budgetary allocations to education. I think that's very interesting to learn, but also quite a bone of conversation as well. Manos, where are your thoughts at?
As you said, Joy, it's a conversation we could be having for days and days. We dedicated an entire volume, the Spotlight report on foundational learning in Africa, trying to just start grappling with the complexity of the topic. I would say there are two broad categories of factors. The first, and maybe it's even not fair to call it a crisis, because this has been a problem for a very, very long time, goes generations back. It's not as if things went worse. They have been weak for a very long time. And the first group of factors are historical factors. They have to do with the fact that countries are linguistically very fragmented. So Africa is now, in most cases, 85% of children are being taught in the language that they not speak at home. And that is a unique characteristic that nowhere else in the world appears. Then the continent is, of course, very poor. And that means not only the lack of resources to invest in education, but also the lack of home resources. Parents are not themselves educated in order to be able to help their children. And there's, of course, a history of conflict that continues to plague many, many parts. But that's the past, and that's really very, very important. There's also the present, what governments currently do, and already we heard Joy and Rudra referring to resources, and I would add one other example of lack of resources, is that children don't even have textbooks. And that's, we're talking about 2023, right? 3 children have to share 1 textbook on average, and in early grade is even worse. But there are also, and inevitably teachers are not well prepared, as we discussed, but there are also a few other important aspects on the policymaker side. The first is sometimes policymakers are not sufficiently attuned to focus on equity, and really foundational learning and the lack of foundational learning is a problem of not paying sufficient attention to the most marginalized. But also it's the fact that maybe policymakers have not realized the extent of the challenge. Maybe they're focusing too much on what's happening in urban areas or the aspirations for the future, and they do not realize how poor the situation is, and therefore they have not geared the whole system to understand that everyone, from the ministry down to the school level, needs to focus on improved learning. There has been a focus, as Rudra said, on getting everyone in school, but now is the time to think of solutions to learning outcomes.
Right. And, you know, when we think about it from the perspective that you mentioned, fragmented populations where different languages are spoken across the continent, but then when they go to school, there's this one foreign language that half the time the entire population of school-going children are just learning it just the same way they would be learning about technology. And, you know, in this case, when we say we are talking about the learners and improving that foundational teaching, how do we go about challenges around fragmented populations and fragmented languages? Because in this case, that is definitely going to affect how they grasp, how much information they take in. So, Joanne, if I might start with you, you know, how do you go about fragmented language, the challenge of fragmented language?
It really is a big challenge and not an easy one to resolve, because depending on which parts of Africa you are in, the languages that apply vary. If you look at South Africa, for example, they have 11 official languages. In Kenya, we have 2. If you go to a country like Ghana, they have, I think, 4 or thereabouts. So I think one approach to use is, besides the typical approved languages or national languages, is really find the commonality. I think for a country like Kenya, maybe Uganda, Tanzania, we have an advantage in the sense that while we have many ethnic languages, we do have one unifying language, so it makes it a little bit easier for policymakers to have policies around the creation of materials, learning materials in those languages, all the way to foundation level. Where languages are more fragmented, it really is a challenge, because there is need for governments to invest in a policy that would be inclusive and equitable and actually create materials in all those languages, and then find the resources to make them available at foundational level. There is also, I think, a need to decrease the gap between school readiness and actual academic learning. I find that there is a disconnect. So a child has come from home, they've been speaking in their mother language, whatever that case might be, and then they get into this space where they're under formal education, and suddenly the language has changed and they have to learn differently. And I think one example of that is what happens in Tanzania, where children complete primary school education, they go to secondary, and they're supposed to transition straight into English from learning in Kiswahili. And in primary school, English is taught as a subject. And so the grasp of it in terms of academic learning for high school creates a lot of challenges. So I think there is that need really to invest in those resources that reduce the gap between school readiness and actual school attendance, so that children are better prepared to adapt to these languages. Because when I look at it, I don't really see a huge change happening in terms of creating materials in all languages. That is a huge investment on any government.
And so the readiness does play a huge role as well. Yes. Speaking of readiness, we asked teachers around the continent why they think children in Africa are having difficulties with literacy and numeracy. Here's what they had to say.
We are in a setup whereby for children to learn and understand, they need to be exposed to whatever they are doing at a right age, at an early age, if I may say so. And in most cases, in setups in Africa, this is still missing, although in urban setups, this has tended to change because of the introduction of early learning facilities.
There are so many factors affecting numeracy, literacy and numeracy in Africa. I'll start with the environment of the schools. I'll talk about the environment of the Tswana medium schools. In our Tswana medium schools, first of all, the resources were limited, talking about resources of books, tables, and so on. And growing up until now, there is no computer literacy in almost all the schools that are there in Botswana.
If you look at our population, the greater part of our kids, they come from the rural areas, of which in those areas they don't have access to those requirements that maybe can enhance numeracy and literacy in the schools.
Just by listening to those teachers, these are teachers who have different citizenship. I think one is Malawian, the other is Zimbabwean, and the other one is Tswana from Botswana. They all seem to talk about the same challenges. I want to hear your reactions to this. Rudra, let me start with you. Your reactions to what the teachers are saying, and then I come to Manus.
Yes, I completely agree with the teachers across the countries, particularly, the curriculum is a major challenge. And when even we visited the schools, it's not only the curriculum and how the curriculum is being transacted in the classroom situation. So one, the curriculum is mostly content-based. It's not really focusing on the competency and skills, which that's why the children are not being interested in participation in the classroom situation or transaction. At the same time, teachers, when they interact with the, let's say, transacting these curriculum to the children, they mostly also rely on the rote memorization. That means always what is there in the content, mostly the questions probed on the knowledge base. They don't go for the really probing the children, engaging the children, and putting the children in a situation so that they can engage or apply their knowledge and skills in a certain situation. This kind of things happening in the schools. That means it's not just only the curriculum, but how the curriculum is being transacted in the classroom situation. I think these are the main pedagogical aspects we need to look at.
All right, Manus, when you talk about foundational learning and the well-being and future of Africa's burgeoning population, the question, is then now, what does this mean even to the achievement of SDG 4, which is quality education?
This is a perennial debate, and many people sometimes ask the question, why foundational learning and what difference does it make? The economy and societal needs request also high-level advanced competencies to manage the changes that are coming. But without foundational skills, and let's not forget most other regions in the world were in a much better position for all those historical reasons that I was mentioning earlier, to have foundational skills for a bigger part of the population early on. Without these, the opportunities to build a skill-based economy just simply disappears. When political leaders claim that they want to have 21st century skills, it is impossible to achieve that without simple ability to understand texts, act on them, do calculations. That in itself is the opportunity to start to reading for learning. That's something that, as you said in the beginning, your introduction, evading the vast majority of children in the continent right now. We don't have enough data, it's true. Really, we only have reliable data for 1 out of 3 children in Africa, and that's a major gap. I think that also kind of perpetuates the fact that policymakers may not be fully informed. There's also a culture, let's not forget, in Africa of prioritizing or privileging examinations at the end of primary education, for instance. But these examinations are simply trying to distinguish the better students from the worst students to help those progress. But it doesn't tell us whether they have really learned what is required to continue with success in secondary education. So a need of a shift of culture to understand that we need to have standards of what children need to learn by each grade, and whether these standards are being achieved is really necessary.
All right. Of course, now that we've talked about the fact that there's lack of resources, and in this case, books are also hard to come by, there's also the expense that comes with it. But when we talk about Edtech, it's trying to eliminate the cost that is associated with having to buy a textbook. What is the role that Edtech can play in making sure that, we're bridging this learning poverty crisis that is currently ongoing in sub-Saharan Africa? John?
I think there are different ways in which we can leverage on Edtech to help actually bridge that gap. I know that there are discussions that can take place around actually increasing the digital divide if this is not done right. But if there is a focused and targeted effort towards bridging the gap, I think it is possible to use tech to really do some good. One way of doing that is really involving the use of community resources, community assets. I know that there are many families that may not be able to afford data or hardware or may not have the right skills to use in order to access education technology. But there are libraries, there are community halls. So the call goes out to implementers, to policymakers, to funders, to use or to strengthen these community resources. I'm thinking more about those who are less resourced, those that would not be able to walk into just a private library and access content. If these community resources can be strengthened, I think it is possible then to have better inclusion. Because if a child doesn't have a phone at home or they don't have tablets, whatever technology we are talking about, they can access it at the public library. If I may just take a moment and speak about some of the work that we have done as World Reader, we partnered with Kenya National Library Services. So currently, we have digital reading programs in all 64 branches. Now, these 64 branches, each and every one of those branches has partnerships with schools where they take books out into the schools and into the communities. They have other activities, whether it's for youth, for women, for men. And within these activities are aspects of education, technology being put to use. Now, for those families that may not be in an urban area or sort of far off rural areas, when these digital resources come to them, then we are being more inclusive, we are reducing the gap. I think this government, in Kenya specifically, has laid the foundation for the use of Edtech by putting all government services online. So the mindset shift has already happened. The foundation has already been built. It is now time for players to actualize it, bring the services down to the people so that they can benefit from those digital resources. Now, Manu mentioned something which I was thinking about, around the disconnect between workforce readiness and the foundational skills. People keep talking about the digital economy and what have you. One critical component of foundational learning is social emotional learning. This focuses on things like decision making, self-awareness, self-regulation, communication, all those things. If you don't build those skills at foundational level, these things that we are calling 21st century skills, problem solving, critical thinking, communication, digital literacy will be lacking. And so you get a workforce going, into that space and they don't have good collaboration skills. And so employers are saying, we are spending thousands of shillings, thousands of dollars, building the foundational skills that should have happened when they were at age 3, 4, 5. So there is that need to really build that muscle for education technology, for digital literacy, for digital skills, so that when these people join the workforce, 15 years later, 20 years later, they're actually ready for what is coming at them. I think it's a long-term investment.
It is a long-term investment indeed, and I want to hear the views from Rudra and Manos. But before that, we took it back to the teachers, and the teachers had thoughts around how technology has helped them improve foundational literacy and numeracy for young learners, and also the EdTech solutions that they're using to improve literacy and numeracy in the different schools that they teach across Africa. Take a listen.
The introduction of technology has really helped in the fundamental of literacy and numeracy. I'll take, for instance, in our school, Regent Hill School, post-COVID, we introduced tablets And then we introduced online teaching and online learning, which helped us to interact with our students during COVID and even after COVID.
Well, as a school, we have noticed that the use of these devices is a very good way of improving literacy and numeracy in the learners. And we have introduced programs in school. For example, in our school, ICT is taught from as early as preschool. When the children come into preschool, they are exposed to the use of ICT gadgets. And at the same time, we have acquired a customized tablet which the school provides to parents at an extra but nominal expense. And this helps the children to play around and navigate and do assignments which are related to their reading, mathematics, and other areas of study.
Right, and you can see that it's working in the schools where it's being implemented. But to Rudra, can the use and mainstreaming of hybrid models of learning, such as Edtech, lead to better learning outcomes? It's not really can, but how can this lead to better learning outcomes with the use of Edtech?
Okay, thank you so very much, John. And particularly, I really concurred with the teachers where they just mentioned about the, let's say, the facility provided through education technology. Particularly personally, if I relate, I visited few schools last week. Particularly the schools were connected and having tablets and the classroom being transacted using educational technology. It's not just the let's say the performance of the children, but what we saw from the schools, really digital learning helping children's attendance, enrollment. Children are more motivated. They are engaging more time in the schools. Teachers' absenteeism also reduced. They are more motivated to engage with children and coming to schools. So these are the really encouraging indicators for education, particularly can be achieved through digital learning. At the same time, what UNICEF is supporting countries to institutionalize the digital learning. One is UNICEF is supporting countries in development of digital learning policy and education strategy, which is aligned with their education sector plan and costed. That will definitely help countries in building the digital infrastructure for the schools, particularly how the digital learning being transacted in the school. This is one. And the second is UNICEF is also supporting 15 countries in this region to come up with learning management system, which is open for every children, for every child. But at the same time, UNICEF is also expanding the partnership, for instance, with Airtel, Edtech Hub, and Camera Education and other partners, particularly to generating the platform so that the children are not able to spend money on data to download those contents. So UNICEF is also supporting that aspect. And also so far in this region, 15,000 curriculum mapped has been developed across the country. Children can access those content, which is curriculum map, very systematically arranged, and also varied, let's say, experience kind of various experience such as your video, audio, and reading materials, which is engaging and interesting. And also in partnership with Airtel, schools are being connected. That means there will be free data for the schools, and children can access, teacher can access, that they can also go to the site and learn. So these are the interventions UNICEF are doing to encourage and expand the digital learning and taking this digital learning at the school and children level. And additionally, also, the major roadblock in disseminating digital learning is the devices. So how we can bring in devices, and for that also we are linking devices to the digital learning policy and education strategy. And most of the countries, and let's say at the sub-national level, they're coming up with each child a laptop or each child a device. So this is also being implemented in few countries at the sub-national level, but we need to really accelerate and bringing in more partners to expand it. Over to you. Thank you.
All right. Manos, There's certainly a huge role that education technology plays in ensuring that we have better learning outcomes. But from where you sit, how best have your recommendations been, or how best can they support even better implementation of EdTech in learning institutions at the foundational level?
So there are multiple angles to this complicated question. Let's start first of all with what is the potential. The potential definitely is highest for the application of technology in foundational levels, because we know that the way children learn these foundational skills is based on repetition, can be based on drilling, can be based on continuous practice. It's not the only way, but it is an essential component. And we know that that's where technology tools have been developed to support it. They may not be, technology tools may not be as good for more complicated tasks, but for tasks at this level, they do have an advantage, and it has been documented in richer countries. The second is what you have already discussed, which is that, especially given the language problem, the fact that so many children are being taught in another language, and therefore there is a need, contested, but definitely a need for children to have more opportunities to learn in their home language. Technology can make more resources available at a lower cost, because right now there are not just textbooks, but there are no supplementary reading materials at all for children to be motivated and stimulated by seeing such textbooks. And the third is potentially the cost of teacher professional development. Distance learning can potentially help reduce costs, fill a gap that is really severe, because teachers need a lot of support, and trying to bring them all together in one place is very, very costly. So technology can potentially bridge that gap. Now, the big question is, how fast can this happen, or should this happen? Rudra was mentioning the need to procure more internet and devices, because currently, we should not forget, levels of access are extremely low. So therefore, it is inevitable that we might be supporting those that are already much better off in a much more privileged position. So equity concerns are very important. And the second and final, perhaps, point to say on implementation is governments need to know what they're doing. They need to deploy software, because I think that's the main two devices is a different conversation, but tools that have been proven to work. But governments do not have enough capacity, enough evidence, enough well-intentioned informers to advise them properly on investments that will be not only effective, but also sustainable. And that is a major conundrum, how governments will develop the expertise to understand what are the tools that could be really deployed and help all learners, and not just the privileged few.
And in addition, also making use of the data, just like you said, there is data, but putting this data to use as well is one other thing altogether. John, in this case, what commitments need to be made to make sure that at least we are moving forward? We've talked about the potential that EdTech has to turn around and probably leapfrog learning outcomes at the foundational level in sub-Saharan Africa. But there are commitments. Are we following these commitments to the letter?
I don't think any government is following the commitments to the letter due to various reasons. But one gap I see is our policies are in place, but they can do better in terms of bringing parents and caregivers on board. I talked earlier about school readiness. This child comes from home, goes to school, and it's a totally new environment. It can be quite traumatic. What if our policies, they exist? What if through school management boards and such field offices can bring these parents on board earlier? As the child is coming into the ECD space, there is that connection between what is in the home and what is at school. Most homes have a mobile phone of some type. So that's, I would say, the first, not actually the first, it's somewhere along the ladder of interacting or engaging with technology, because people have sometimes radio, TV, They use remotes. They're very basic items, but they can get you onto the path of thinking about technology in a different way. What if it was introduced in the early years at home so that the child knows, perhaps I can read storybooks on my phone? Why did I put storybooks free to access, to use, free to access, available on any digital device? What if you started reading your stories on something like that and having a discussion? What if parents could engage through these structures that have been set up? Parents' capacity is built to engage with these children. When they do come to school, then they are a little bit ready. They can then, it makes the job easier for the teacher and for everybody else to then acquire the digital literacy skills, because these digital literacy skills we have to be able to apply them in our life in order to improve the quality of the life that we are living, because we are in a hybrid economy. We are not yet 100% digital, we are in hybrid. So to support the transition of that hybrid, we need to start really early.
All right, starting early to just fill up those gaps. Public and private investments are also essential in this situation, because most of the schools will say they lack resources, but they also lack the financing. And so public and private investments are needed to transform education for young learners in Africa. How do we go about this, Rudra and Manus?
Yeah, the public financing for our education should be increased at least a level, let's say 4 to 6%. But if you see in the African countries, most of the countries are spending less than 3%. That means they must to increase the public funding on education. This is fun. That means we need to also, all the partners together, we come together and advocate with the government to increase public spending. But at the same time, as Manav will agree with me, subsequent to the 2022 September Test Summit, we have big six partner. That means at the same time, it's not just the government responsibility, but how the big six would come forward and support countries with the gaps where they have particularly financing the public education. This is one. Then the other part is, I'm just coming back again to the digital learning, how we can promote digital learning maybe in a cost-effective way. The teacher capacity is also very, very important, which we are missing in our, let's say, discussion or maybe action. Most of the countries are also spending their resources on the teacher training, and most of the time those teacher training are not, let's say, most effective, or not giving the right result. So how we can revamp the teacher training so that the resources will be optimally used, and particularly in this context of education technology. So how we can integrate education technology and how the teacher can use technology in the classroom must be integrated with the continuous teacher professional development. That would be a cost-effective way to address the Edtech solution for the classrooms.
Right. And Manos, we talk about the role of foundational literacy and numeracy to future skills as well. But, education policies drive curriculum development. And without good policies, the curriculum as well is affected along the way. And we need to make sure that this early childhood development and foundational learning plays a role in the future as well. So how do we go about this? How can education policies drive better curriculum development?
Well, we captured a little bit the discussion on the curriculum earlier when the teachers expressed their views, and I think Rudra mentioned a little bit how the curriculum and it tends not to be competence-based, and how the pedagogy is often wrong. There's a lot of debate over whether the curriculum is actually too ambitious in early grades, too much influenced by history and not by the real needs of children. Also, it's not aligned very much with the syllabus that follows and the textbooks. So there are a lot of issues here which policy needs to address, and it's something that we will be looking at the Spotlight series in the next cycle when we publish a report in a year from now. But to go to the general question of financing that we mentioned before, household contributions to education are really very high in Africa. 4 out of $10 that are spent on education actually come from families, almost the highest percentage in the world, and that has huge implications for equity. And however much advocacy we do to governments to spend more, it's true many may be spending very little as a percentage of their income because they don't raise enough taxes, but they spend a lot in terms of the budget because they have to. They have so many children. Education is a costly enterprise, and there are not that many limits. And that should make us very cautious and very careful when we do investments in education technology, because given the lack of resources on basic things from desks to textbooks to facilities to tutors to supporters for teachers, one has to be absolutely sure that the dollar that should be spent in these more traditional activities should be spent on education. And that's why I was insisting before that governments need to be very careful. Education technology is also a market. And of course, every seller has an interest to sell more, most of their services. So we need to be able to give governments the right advice to do the right investments and to build their own capacity to select, understand, and select those investments in technology that are most important for the future. And foundational learning is, of course, the best investment.
Right, and you did mention that you've partnered with the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, as well as the African Union. And so I believe that they are putting to use all of this data that is coming from the Global Education Monitoring Report. As we bring this conversation to a close, and probably in our parting shots, I would like to know the role of parents in ensuring that we are having good foundational literacy and numeracy outcomes, because there's a role they play. And as we talk about infusing EdTech at this level, there's a role that parents can play as well. Joanne.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I will be brief. I think in a lot of designs that I see now, the role of parents has sort of become secondary as opposed to primary. And if you look at the responses that are taking place, the role of parents is really being brought to the fore, because literacy and numeracy is something you learn from the time you are born. Whether you are told, bring me the one orange or whatever it is, whether it is through storytelling, the basic, basic learning of literacy, parents have a very strong role to play. And I think if our governments can also invest, like I say, through the structures that exist, our school systems, their role is really brought to light. I think they can go a long way in supporting their children acquire these skills, as opposed to the kind of attitude that exists quite a bit right now, that it is the teacher's job. It's not just the teacher's job. Parents have a role to play. Africa, in terms of technology, we are growing. Some countries are ahead of others. We are growing, but we can leverage that technology right from the household into the school, reduce that school preparedness that we were talking about, and actually get kids ready at a foundational stage to enter the school and begin to build towards their future when they'll be entering the workforce.
All right. Of course, our topic is improving foundational literacy and numeracy through hybrid models of learning. And I want to hear parting shots from Manos and Rudra. Rudra, let me start with you. How do we take this forward?
Okay, you rightly mentioned about the policy. This is the starting point. That means we need to ensure that right policy for the digital learning, and also many countries are coming up with this. For instance, UNICEF is supporting Ethiopia to come up with a digital learning policy, and it is connected to the digital education strategy and the costed education sector plan. This is one of the best practices countries are taking taking forward to ensure there is enough resources to implement digital learning. This is one. And the second, as I mentioned about, we need to, let's say, complement each other's partnership, particularly what are the big partners are doing. And instead of duplicating things, we need to complement each other's works. And more importantly, we need to converge at the same location. But why I'm saying this? Because, you know, to implement digital learning, there are different strands. Different strands mean that to successfully implement digital learning, we need to have platform, we need to have capacities, connectivity, contents, and all that. That means for one partner, it is really impossible to bring in such resources to implement. So how we can complement with each other partners and more importantly, converge in the same geography to see the quick result for the children. So I think we need to work on this and to work towards this to bring digital learning on a, let's say, sustainable way to support children.
All right, Manus.
Sustainability is the word, I think, in this case, and I think there is no more appropriate solution to sustainability other than the governments themselves, beyond what partners do, the governments themselves, the countries themselves, to understand that there is a problem, but to see it as a positive challenge, one that has not received their attention so far, but with good dialogue between them, and there are the right forums for this to happen, by bringing their positive experiences, by showing that it is a problem that can be solved and that there are different solutions. Technology might be one of them. That's the way forward. I think it's a matter of changing a little bit the terms of the debate and for countries to really perceive it as their own challenge that they have to solve.
All right. Thank you all so much for making this conversation very insightful and very knowledgeable. And at least for now, we know that there are solutions to this learning poverty at the foundational level. And of course, without the support of partnerships and, you know, the implementers such as Worldreader, there's so much more that can be done to ensure that foundational literacy and numeracy has better outcomes for our children across Africa. So with that, I believe that this conversation would now lead into more conversations on EdTech Monday Africa that are, of course, related to ensuring that our education across the African continent is bettered through technology-backed education solutions and tools. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Thank you all for being a part of EdTech Monday Africa this month. Until the next edition, see you then.
EdTech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and is part of the Foundation's Young Africa Works programming.